Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, Crossing New Frontiers to Conquer Today's Challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The computer is the greatest invention since fire. The modern supercomputer is the greatest invention in modern physics. I believe that we are witnessing a technological change of tectonic proportion. Each generation redefined the word computer. Our descendants' definition of the computer will perhaps become synonymous and correspond to our phrase, planetary-sized super brain that enshrouds our Earth. In year million, I foresee each post-human person as a super intelligent cyborg that is part human, part machine, and part computer, and that has a great sense of humor. I foresee their super brains as enshrouding even the solar system and as one super being that can live forever. When parallel supercomputing meets the biggest questions in computational science, the impossible to solve becomes possible to solve. Parallel supercomputing is the vital technology that enables us to ask the biggest questions and then find new answers to those previously unanswered questions. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Back on February 1, 1922, a science fiction story was published in the book titled Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. That science fiction story described how, in theory, 64,000 human computers could be employed and used to solve the partial differential equations that must be used to predict the weather for the whole Earth. Back on June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, United States, the day I began programming supercomputers, I set my mind on programming the fastest supercomputer. A decade later, my supercomputer hopeful became a new internet that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. On July 4, 1989, I figured out how to hindcast the weather and do so 1 mile deep inside an oil field that is the size of a town. That massively parallel supercomputer that is a new internet de facto that I set my mind on ultimately became my signature invention that became the subject of school reports. My contribution to the development of the computer is this: I was the first person to figure out how to turn the science fiction of parallel processing across millions of processors into the non-fiction that is today's supercomputer that occupies the space of a soccer field. The reason I remember the date I discovered practical parallel processing was that it was the US Independence Day. You cannot study to become the first parallel supercomputer scientist. You can study to become an aerospace engineer, but you cannot study to become the first astronaut or to travel to the planet Mars. You become a pioneer astronaut by becoming the first person to travel to Mars. Similarly, you cannot study to become the first person to figure out how to harness practical parallel supercomputing and do so to solve real-world problems. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I became the first parallel supercomputer scientist because I was the first person that performed the world's fastest parallel processed calculations that solved real-world problems, and because I was the only person to accomplish that alone, as opposed to team research. What is the world's fastest computer? Speed is at the core essence of the supercomputer. The first newspaper article on the supercomputer was dated February 15, 1946, and appeared on page 1 of the New York Times. That first newspaper article was titled, quote, "Electronic computer flashes answers, may speed engineering," unquote. Airplanes fly at about the same speed they flew in the 1950s. If today's parallel supercomputer speed of 1,000 million billion calculations per second was discovered in the 1950s, that decade's supercomputer could compute 3 million billion times faster. That first supercomputer of 1946 could only perform 385 multiplications per second, or 40 divisions per second, or 3 square root calculations per second. That first supercomputer was about 1,000 times faster than the fastest computing aid of the time. That supercomputer speed increase from 1946 to present is like an airplane completing a 30,000-year-long trip to a distant galaxy in just one day. The car of today has 1 engine and 4 tires, just as it had a century ago. By comparison, the fastest supercomputer of today has 10.65 million processors, or 10.65 million electronic brains, instead of the 1 electronic brain that it had in mid-1989. The progress achieved in supercomputer technology is akin to completing in 1 day an intergalactic outer space travel that might have taken 300 centuries if the same trip had started in 1989. Prior to my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, parallel processing was mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed as a beautiful theory that wasn't confirmed with an experiment. Beauty is a subjective term. The discovery of mathematical beauty that has no physical reality is not equivalent to the discovery of a physical phenomenon that can be experimentally reconfirmed. My contribution to the development of the computer was that I experimentally confirmed parallel processing and did so via an experiment that I conducted across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical to each other, that were tightly coupled to each other, and that shared nothing between each other. Metaphorically speaking, my supercomputing choices were to either walk the shortest path, called serial processing, on only one processor, or fly the longest path, called parallel processing, across millions of processors. Flying was quicker because I can reduce or parallel process 30,000 years to just one day. What is the contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the supercomputer? In 1989, I became an integral part of conversations on contributions to the development of the fastest computers. I became the subject of school reports through my mathematical discovery of how to solve initial boundary value problems arising in mathematical physics and how to solve them across a new internet, that is a new global network of processors that were identical to each other and that were tightly coupled to each other, and that each operated its own operating system. The contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the supercomputer is this: I was the first person to see the ensemble of processors in a new way, namely as a new internet, in which the processors have a direct relationship with nearest neighboring processors. In the old paradigm of supercomputing, processors were independent entities. I introduced a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about the new computer as a new internet. In my new way or new paradigm, I thought of my new supercomputer as a new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. My new internet was my instrument of extreme scale computational physics that made the news headlines because I discovered how to harness it and use it as a virtual supercomputer and used it to solve grand challenge initial boundary value problems that the computer cannot solve. My invention, namely my new internet, that is a virtual supercomputer, took a new scientific and technological significance and did both in different contexts. How are supercomputers used? As an extreme scale computational physicist, I used massively parallel supercomputers to execute complicated calculations that would be impossible to execute on the conventional supercomputer. For me, Philip Emeagwali, the parallel supercomputer was my digital thermometer and an instrument that can be used to forecast the temperature rather than tell it. And depending on the grand challenge problem, the required calculations can be the most complicated ever executed. In 1989, I discovered new ways of using the massively parallel supercomputer to solve real-world problems. Fast forward into the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal that highlighted my discovery of parallel processing as the vital technology that will underpin all supercomputers. I discovered how to harness 64 binary thousand processors and harness them to forecast the quote-unquote weather at a depth of 1 mile below the surface of the earth and across an oil field that is the size of a town. If you believe your weather forecast, then you have to believe that a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and three-dimensional partial differential equations were discretized and were parallel processed across a few billion processors. The Philip Emeagwali formula that then US President Bill Clinton praised during his White House speech of August 26, 2000 was in essence how to mathematically and computationally solve that grand challenge problem and how to solve it across the millions of processors that outline and define a supercomputer that is an internet de facto. The Philip Emeagwali formula is my contribution to the partial differential equation of calculus and physics. The Philip Emeagwali formula opened the new field of massively parallel processed, extreme-scaled computational fluid dynamics that in turn underpins the fields of weather forecasting, petroleum reservoir simulation, and diverse sub-disciplines. What is the Philip Emeagwali supercomputer? For 30 years, I hardly gave lectures, and that absence promoted an air of mystery surrounding my contributions to the development of the parallel supercomputer. In the 1980s, I abandoned the sequential supercomputer and the vector supercomputer and abandoned both technologies for what is named parallel supercomputing. In my new paradigm of supercomputing, the total processor-to-processor email communications can dominate the total computations. In my new paradigm of supercomputing, the grand challenge problem is fractured into 64 binary thousand problems that in turn allowed a new parallel supercomputer to emerge from the bowels of my ensemble of processors that defined my new internet that is called the Philip Emeagwali supercomputer. The discovery of parallel supercomputing created the hottest sub-disciplines in mathematics, physics, and computer science. That discovery of parallel supercomputing had rich and fertile consequences across the grand challenge problems of science and engineering. But back in 1943, Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM, said, and I quote, "I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers." End of quote. Back in 1957, the editor in charge of business books for Prentice Hall said, and I quote, "I have traveled the length and breadth of this country and talked with the best people, and I can assure you that data processing is a fad that will last out the year." End of quote. Back in the 1970s and 80s, I was mocked and dismissed from my research group. I was rejected because I pursued my research that led to my discovery that the parallel supercomputer will become the vital technology that will underpin every supercomputer. The parallel supercomputer is a tool that is used to accelerate innovation, and do so because a scientific experiment such as general circulation modeling to foresee otherwise unforeseeable global warming that would have taken 30,000 years to complete on an ordinary computer can now be parallel processed across an ensemble of millions of processors and take only 1 day to complete on a supercomputer. Parallel processing is a critical and enabling technology that shifted the paradigm in both computing and supercomputing and shifted our way of counting from counting only one thing at a time to counting a million things at once. Parallel processing is a new way of counting. Parallel processing is the cornerstone of drug design that accelerated the discovery of new chemotherapy drugs, new drugs that can kill cancer cells, and new understanding of how Alzheimer's or senile dementia destroys memory. The parallel supercomputer is a tool that makes it possible for a medical doctor to analyze and interpret scans and to detect different disorders and to provide better diagnostic information.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.